That? Oh, you're meeting. Okay. Do you want this open to get a breeze, or is it?
Well, the challenge is the kids.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Editor keeps coming in and like Zoom on me.
Okay.
So we're going to start. It's time. Hello everybody. My name is Alejandro Esteves. I am the director of the CDOP of the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. I wish to welcome everybody to our Public Policy in Context cycle. Our today's webinar is about advocacy coalitions and emotional expressions. And our speaker is Professor Christopher WEIBLE. Professor WEIBLE is a PhD in ecology from the University of California, Davis. Also is professor in School of Public Affairs in University of Colorado, Denver. He is co-director of Center for Policy and Democracy, and also he is co-director of Policy and Politics Journal, a great journal. He teaches course in environmental politics, policy process, policy analysis, and research method in public policy. He has published over 100 articles and book chapters. His edited volumes include Theory of the Policy Process with Paul Sabatier, Methods of the Policy Process with Sam Workman, and Policy Debates in Hydraulic Fracturing. And for the comments, we have the renowned Professor Ivana Zacarias. She is a PhD at University of Barcelona. She has an EDM in International Education Policy from Harvard University, and she's Director of Learning and Development for LATAM of CODX. And she's the actual president of the non-governmental organization América Solidaria Argentina. So let's start with our cycle. Please, Christopher, you can start when you want.
Okay. Well, Alejandro, thank you so much for the introduction, and welcome everyone to the seminar. I'm going to share my screen now, and I hope you can see it. Yeah, so this is I'm Chris WEIBLE, and as I was mentioned, I'm with the School of Public Affairs. I'm a professor there. I co-direct the Center for Policy and Democracy and co-edit Policy and Politics. I'm going to share some work that involves advocacy coalitions and emotional expressions. One of my colleagues, Allegra, is actually on the Zoom. Maybe there's more on the YouTube also, but I'll be showing also some of our recent empirical work on emotional expressions later on in this talk. And before I get started, I would like to kind of say that, you know, when you think of the advocacy coalition framework, which is this is about, it is not an easy thing to describe or even relay to someone. It's somewhat amorphous. It can be difficult to communicate, and I think part of the challenge is that it is so many things to so many different people. And of course, there's the kind of like the textbook explanation. And this primarily involves, like, you know, if you open up theories of the policy process book or like various encyclopedia entries or a lot of publications, you'll see something about the assumptions and various concepts, hypotheses, and so forth. But the ACF is in a way so much more than that. And what I mean by that, it involves essentially the people that are kind of a part of it. And these people in this framework essentially form a research program that has knowledge embedded in it. These people work together, often, you know, asking the similar questions, looking to solve similar puzzles, and using similar techniques to try to, like, essentially, you know, advance our knowledge and also maybe make a better world. And so, yeah, I could go through and kind of lay out the nuts and bolts, the textbook description of the ACF as written down, but also find it's often telling to kind of understand this framework by how people are actually applying it and using it right now. And so, for example, if you were to just look at the publications that are have used the ACF so far this year, there's been 58, and this is not a scientific study at all, but roughly 58 ACF applications. These are applications that use the ACF or discuss it in a deep theoretical way, or perhaps do a literature review involving the ACF. These are what the titles, the words that are involved in the titles. And what I like about this is that it kind of shows like how the framework is being used internationally and what people are emphasizing and doing. So for example, of course, you see the word coalition. You might see the word policy, process. You might see the word study, like, it's kind of some of these concept words, but also you'll see words that relate to how or where it's studied. You might see, topical areas like forest in there. You might see health, education. It is applied across different topics. And you also see different parts of the world. You'll see the word China in there. You might see the word Africa. You might see the word, I know it's applied in various other parts of the world, be it US or wherever. But this is kind of like what's happening so far this year, which is actually kind of telling you about what this framework is about. And if you look beyond, so what does this research community look like? These applications do span, this is again, just the 58. This is where the author affiliations are of these applications just so far this year. And you do see like, yeah, most of them are in the United States this year, but they kind of spread everywhere from China to Nepal to Indonesia to India, New Zealand to Brazil, Mexico. And, of course, across many European countries and so forth. What's interesting about this too is that, I've done this sort of work for almost 20 years now. And, it's not uncommon. I know the ACF started in the United States, but oftentimes it's applied more elsewhere. I think this is the first time I've actually found that it's applied more in the US than in other countries, at least in my counts of this. So that's kind of surprising to me. But it is what it is. At least this at this time of at this point in time. But again, this is just the research community, and there's a lot of different ways to say, okay, what's in this framework? What's it about? And oftentimes this is expressed in hypotheses. I often like to express it in like this vignette. It's kind of the archetypical vignette of the ACF. Or like you can read it, but I'll kind of walk you through it a little bit. It's basically a little story of what the ACF is about. It is about high conflict situations where policy actors or people actively engaged in these these policy debates, coordinate their behavior among allies in a coalition, and they try to influence policy while their opponents do the same. Oftentimes they coalesce around these policy core beliefs, these fundamental values that relate to a policy issue. And oftentimes these coalitions will show stability over time, and they engage each other in various debates and argumentation. And oftentimes there's learning, but it's kind of interesting. Learning mostly occurs within the same coalition. And this often leads to more reinforcement and re-entrenchment of those beliefs, and often exacerbation of the conflict than otherwise. And so, yeah, learning rarely occurs between coalitions, but there's still hope there. Sometimes some of these policy actors might be policy brokers and help facilitate cross-coalition learning. And of course, the goal of all these coalitions is to somehow achieve influence policymaking. And oftentimes they exploit like these events, internal, external events, or maybe there's a rare occurrence of cross-coalition learning or a herding stalemate where they basically are dissatisfied with the status quo and run out of other options outside of needing to negotiate with their opponents. And, there's a lot of concepts there, a lot going on here, but it's interesting. Most of the ACF hypotheses are embedded in this little paragraph, and people spend their time focusing on some aspects of this and some others. And for the most part, this paragraph has been confirmed around the world, but there's always exceptions. There's always situations where the coalitions aren't stable, where there's something other than policy core beliefs kind of forming them and so forth, where learning does occur across coalitions. But this is kind of like, if you want to, like the elevator speech of the ACF, the story, this is kind of what it is. And it also includes kind of three major theoretical emphases. The first couple sentences are about advocacy coalitions, these kind of alliances that form around policy core beliefs. And what's interesting here is some people, when they apply the ACF, just examine coalitions. That's all they do. What's their structure, their formation, and so forth. The middle sentences are all about policy-oriented learning, like the updating, the changing of these beliefs. Again, most of that involves reinforcement, but some people really focus on that. And of course, policy change at the bottom. And sometimes you need to study coalitions to understand policy change, but sometimes those studies of coalitions may not be as detailed or as sophisticated if the emphasis is on policy change. Some people do all three in single publication. Some people don't. It really kind of depends on what your research questions are and what your emphases are. By the way, this little paragraph is taken from a publication with Alex Osai-Kojo and Karen Ingold, recently published this year, involving a review of ACF in African countries. I'd be very happy in the Q&A to talk about, because some of the key words I italicized, very happy to talk about any of those italicized words in the Q&A today. But right now I'm just going to leave it as is. I'm going to move on. And I do want to show different categories of ACF scholarship. So let's say you're outside this field and you're looking into it. What are you going to see when you start looking at the publications? First off, you're going to see some descriptions of the major kind of descriptions of the theory and the methods of this framework. So, for example, you might go back to 1988 with Paul Sabatier. That's one of the first publications that kind of talked about the theory. But also more recently, Jenkins Smith. Forthcoming in the New Theories of the Policy Process book with Daniel Norstedt as the lead. That'll be come out later this year. Or you might find something about the methods with Adam Henry taking the lead in the Methods of the Policy Process book. But these are just kind of general descriptions of the framework. You'll find many empirical applications. I kind of listed those in those previous map. But yeah, there's I can't keep track of them all. There's a lot of them. You'll find various reviews of the application. So this is really important. There's a lot of applications out there. And for example, someone like John Pierce will review them and comment on the quality of the methods or what needs to be done. You might find, I already mentioned Alex Osai-Kojo, who kind of led the way for analysis of what we learned about the ACF as applied across African countries. Kayla Gabehart led an effort on understanding the ACF and how it's been applied to climate change, and how this framework helped us inform perhaps various aspects of its politics. And finally, this is kind of an area not really focused on much, but it's going to be the focus of today. So this is why I'm bringing it up. And these are kind of something like I'm calling right now theory or somewhat theory or method modules. These are narrow functional units usable in the ACF for a particular purpose. So for example, you'll find, if you look at Dallas Elgin's work from about 10 years ago, he focused on policy analytic capacity, the ability for government to process information. And he kind of uploaded that in the ACF and can use it to kind of understand coalitions. And some of these modules exist outside the framework, but are kind of brought in, like Phil Bleifield's discourse network analysis, which we use here. And that's basically revolutionized how ACF scholars analyze text in their network. Hank Jenkins Smith brought in cultural theory, which of course was developed by Mary Douglas and Aaron Vildosky 30 years ago or 40 years ago. He brought it in and said, hey, this theory is really good for analyzing deep core beliefs and more, but it's something that you can upload into the framework if you want to understand various aspects of it. Today, I'm going to talk about just the analysis of emotional expressions. Maybe something new that, Allegra Fullerton, who's on board here, and Kayla Gabehart, myself and others are really trying to figure out, so if you want to understand emotions and emotional expressions in the ACF, how do you do it? And we're providing hopefully a way that will help people do this. And finally, one thing I'm not seeing is these kind of country-specific or region-specific modules. And this is where, for example, in Argentina, maybe that vignette I showed, that was kind of developed in Western democracies. So would it hold also in Argentina? Or would it hold in other parts of the world? Maybe we need to tweak it. Maybe we need a theoretical module for Argentina that helps scholars understand the coalition politics there. And so we could compare it to, let's say, Switzerland and compare and contrast, because we know there's differences across countries. So that's something we might want to think about developing too. But these are just the general categories of, if you just type in ACF, this is kind of what you often will see. And that's kind of, I'm going to move on, but that's kind of the introduction of what the ACF's about as a framework. I'm going to get into an application right now and show what some of the recent stuff we're doing on emotional expressions of advocacy coalitions. And this is with Allegra Fullerton and Kayla Gabehart. Allegra's here on the Zoom, and Kayla Gabehart, I don't know if she's there or not, but this is the application we're showing. So if you have actually questions, actually, I encourage you to kind of chat it up with Allegra, and she would be very happy to answer them. I will. Let's get this started here. Oops. Okay, ACF and emotions. Okay, in some ways, emotions have always been part of the ACF. And so I'm going to drop some ACF jargon here. So for example, the ACF is something called the devil shift, which is, essentially exaggerating the power and the maliciousness. It's kind of demonizing your opponents. And that's rooted in fear and threats. It also has something called the herding stalemate, where basically, I mentioned this earlier, where coalitions have run out of venues to try to achieve their objectives, but are really dissatisfied. They're hurting right now in this the current situation, and so they have to negotiate with their opponents. It's a certain condition that they get in, which is part of pain. If they're feeling pain or suffering of where they're at. And then also sometimes in the ACF literature, there's a whole list of different belief components. One is, for example, groups whose welfare is of greatest concern. It's like a belief measure. And so in a way, and that's an expression of compassion or caring, right? And so in a way, ACF's kind of indirectly talked about emotions all the time, but yet in other ways it hasn't. There's no empirical or theoretical work on emotions until really what you're seeing now. And, up to now, the ACF has always kind of emphasized the thinking attributes of policy actors, the pro or con policy preferences, kind of the cognitive limitations it talked about. In a way, it kind of emphasized the thinking part of being human, not the feeling part of being human. And not that we wanted to throw out the kind of the reasoning, the puzzle solving aspect of our brains, but also we don't want to neglect or ignore the emotional part of it either. And so that's part of this goal, is not to discount what's been done in the ACF, but to add to it. Some definitions. Gosh, okay, first off, I'll leave it to Allegra, and I think even Anna Denova signed on earlier on today. There's people on this chat who know way more about emotions and affect than I do. But I will say, across the literature, there's a lot of different definitions, and we need to just kind of narrow it down in this particular paper, in this work. So we're defining affect as basically the biological, physiological feelings, often ambivalent, amorphous in our heads, kind of how we feel. That's there. But we're not studying that. What we are studying is the expressions, the language we use to kind of express those feelings through our words. Here we're looking at newspaper text or statements in newspapers, but we are interested in emotional expressions, which also means that we're not actually studying how people actually feel. That's not really our point here. Our point is how they're expressing those feelings in those emotional expressions. And of course, there might be a correlation there. But we're not going to comment too much on that. We're also studying linkages. What are people expressing their emotions about? And here we're talking about emotional expressions linked to some aspects of their belief system. ACF has always studied expressed belief systems, perhaps as a pro or con position. Now we're looking at how emotional expressions also link to those beliefs. So we're looking at how people are angry about a project or happy about it and so forth. And of course, that actor down there is kind of might be the person expressing those feelings, perhaps. All right, so more into the case. A research question: what are the emotional expressions and policy core beliefs of advocacy coalitions? And for us, we're looking at a pipeline debates. So I'll talk more about the case study in a sec. Our working hypothesis. So first of all, there's not a hypothesis in the ACF about how emotions are used. So we're just starting with something very basic, essentially that emotions, or an advocacy coalition, like the allies there will have similar emotions about policy core beliefs, and opponents will have, different emotions and policy core beliefs compared to the opposite coalition. So another way of saying this, advocacy coalitions will have a unique emotional kind of footprint with their policy core beliefs. That's where we're starting at. Although we can imagine a lot more going on with those hypotheses as we push this forward. Okay. We are looking at essentially a pipeline debate. I'd be very happy to answer questions about this Nexus pipeline. Runs from Ohio to Pennsylvania, 2 U.S. states. It is something, we've published before. Jung-Eun Yoon and Tony Heiko and I published something on, and this is Politics and Policy. It is an unusual context, and the fact that we have a pipeline company trying to impose a pipeline on a community. So it is kind of like an instigator. Someone trying to force someone on someone else. and a defender's type scenario, which is a certain type of conflict. And so we might want to think about that, because not all policy conflicts are that way. Some are very, might be more kind of ongoing discussions about various topics and so forth. But this is the general conflict. It's about the siting of a pipeline. Our methods. Okay, so we're looking at newspaper articles. So we're looking at the public discourse. That's what we care about. In 2 states, Ohio and Pennsylvania, between 2014 and 2017. We identified statements. Basically, we downloaded the articles on this Nexus project, and we looked for statements in these articles that first conveyed an emotion. That's what we used to identify our statements. And then from there, we coded them using Discourse Network Analyzer. This was developed by Philip Liefeld. And this kind of essentially linked emotions to various actors, like a narrator. It linked them to various objects, like a policy core belief, and so forth. We then categorize these emotions and analyze them based on actually emotional expressions developed by Jill Yordi and Anna Donova and myself in a paper under review. And I'll talk about those emotional expressions a little bit, but essentially we use these categories to help kind of categorize things. We weren't kind of glued to this, so because we did update these 12 categories based on this case study. We tried our best not to be like, I guess, to impose it blindly, because the Yordi piece was a different setting. And then also we identify coalition membership. So again, some people will spend an entire publication or almost like an entire research research agenda to identify coalitions and do it in very sophisticated ways. We're not. We basically looked at an actor on our newspapers, looked at their collection of statements and made an assessment. Are they pro, con, or somewhere in the middle, like neutral or undisclosed? Because our point really isn't to find like a really sophisticated understanding of these coalitions. Our goal was to understand how these coalitions are really using emotions tied to their policy core beliefs. We did achieve, and I say we, this is mostly, I'll give credit to Kayla Gibhart and Allegra Fullerton, achieve 80% intercoded reliability. And we're also looking at only self-narrated expression. So how I feel is what we're looking at. We're not looking at like, I think they feel this way. We're not looking at statements that try to articulate the emotions of someone else. All right, just to kind of make this a little more concrete, here's an example. I'm damn mad because people are getting hurt. Here we would code the mad as an expression of anger. People are getting hurt. We would code as kind of like the policy core belief. It's the risk related to the pipeline. The narrator will be Paul Gorowski, and his affiliation is with the Coalition to Reroute Nexus Pipeline. And you know, through all the statements, we found out that he's anti-pipeline, part of that coalition. But that's a sample statement, and we of course put that in our data set, and we did all our little analyses with it. All right, now let me show you some of the data. So first off, some background data. We have 2 coalitions, an anti-pipeline coalition and a pro-pipeline coalition. 292 statements with the anti-pipeline coalition, 88 with the pro coalition. Okay, so the major actors in the anti, of course, are the public, 32%, and this kind of nonprofit coalition to reroute Nexus. And of course, we have a lot of other actors going on there. And also the pro pipeline, we have Nexus, which is the pipeline company, and its parent company, Spectra Electric. What's interesting here is that, you know, there's a lot of different ACF research out there about how to identify coalitions. If a person's using a survey, for example, you might see a very different composition of the coalition. You might not see so many members of the public. You might not see, you might have a more even distribution of viewpoints rather than, let's say, Nexus or the public or coalition to reroute Nexus dominating the discourse. But that's what we have here. This is we are analyzing the discourse, and it is kind of uneven across these different actor categories. Okay, now let's get into the emotions. Okay, so we have the anti and the pro coalition. The anti is on the left, the pro is on the right. I want to walk you through this. We're still looking at these 292 statements, and the 88, 292 for the anti, 88 for the pro. All right, so then we have our emotional categories. Fear all the way down to approval for the anti. Note the reverse direction. These are listed in order of like importance or in frequency. Approval down to fear for the pro. So 29% of the 292 statements, for example, the anti had the emotion fear in it. That's about 85 of those statements. Most of those were linked to these policy core beliefs. These are like the pipeline project, or you pro or con the pipeline as a general statement. The pipeline risks and benefits and the pipeline location are three measures of policy core beliefs. And so most of those expressions of fear are linked to the pipeline and the pipeline kind of risks, and some to the pipeline location. But also you see dissatisfaction, suffering, uncertainty, and so forth. The pro pipelines, very different. It's the opposite, right? They have approval, trust, and those are geared towards the pipeline project and the project benefits. They don't really talk about the pipeline location much at all. But again, we are seeing this unique footprint, emotional footprint of two distinct coalitions linked to their policy core beliefs. In traditional ACF scholarship, again, we just look at like, are you pro or con the pipeline or so forth. This adds another layer of detail about what this conflict looks like and the emotional power underlying these debates. Moving on, we do want to say, okay, so are these coalitions really that different? Okay, so then we did a quadratic assignment procedure, a QAP, and this kind of accounts for the lack of independence of the observations. Very happy to talk about what a QAP is. So basically, we correlated, the coalition membership and this kind of combination of coalition emotions and policy core beliefs, and we did find that there's the linkages, 0.30 significant. What's interesting is if you remove the policy core beliefs from the calculation and just looked at coalition membership and emotions, there's no correlation at all. It's not significant, which is also kind of interesting, so that it's the combination of, in this data, of emotions and policy core beliefs that kind of provide that coalition identity. That being said, there's something unusual about these emotions and this coalition membership, which I'm going to show in the next slide, which is kind of interesting. Now, this slide is kind of complicated. Let me walk you through this. First off, the visual layout. It's multidimensional scaling. And so basically, it takes the data and spreads it horizontally and vertically. And so if things are kind of pushed to the right or the left, there's some sort of pattern that this picks up, and simply pulls it up or down. Before going further, I forgot to say, this is for only the emotions. We're looking at all the statements together, 380. So we're kind of ignoring coalitions in the layout, but I'll bring the coalitions here in a sec. The stress at 0.12 for the multidimensional scaling means that basically that the stress is low enough that this is an accurate representation in 2 dimensions of how these emotions play out. We're using taboo search cluster analysis to we use taboo cluster analysis to kind of cluster these emotions into 4 different categories. That's the optimal. So with the R square of 0.59, it kind of shows that, okay, that's where it kind of peaks at. You can also find circles at 5, 3, or 2 different clusters. That's not the optimal. And so the circles you see are from this clustering. The percentage is now linked to the coalitions. The number on the left is the number of self-narrated expressions using a particular emotion for the anti. The number on the right is the number of emotions, little expressions by the pro-coalition, again on the right. So for example, if you look at the little cluster on the bottom left, you see anger, suffering, fear, dissatisfaction, and you see relatively high percentages for the anti, 4, 10, 23, 15, high in relation to the pro, which is 0, 1, 1, 1. Another way of saying this is that the anti use these expressions a lot and the pro did not. That's why this was kind of pulled in that direction. On the opposite side is approval. The anti takes up less, or the pro coalition takes up less of the public discourse, but they do, of their discourse, they take up 6% of approval, which is very different than the anti. So there's this difference there. But what's interesting, this is why where emotional expressions in the coalition membership don't correlate, is this middle cluster: obligation, want, trust, compassion, uncertainty. These emotions are all shared by the coalitions. There's no difference. And careless at the very top is not used at all. So what you're seeing here is some of these emotions, these coalitions are very different in their use, and some they either don't use at all or they're very much the same, which kind of messes with the correlation coefficient in the previous slide. All right, I'm starting to wrap up here. First off, what are we seeing here? First off, we do see the advocacy coalitions do tend to use emotions in conjunction with their policy core beliefs among allies in a similar way, and and very distinctly from opponents. In other words, they have a distinct emotion, policy core belief footprint. This is what we expect. The anti-pipeline coalition often uses the fear, dissatisfaction, anger, suffering as their emotion, in relation to the pipeline and its risks and benefits and its location, whereas a pro is more about approval and about the pipeline and its risks and benefits. Both coalitions use some emotions evenly, like want, uncertainty, compassion, trust, obligation, and others rarely, like careless and content. In interpreting these results, it is a US case. Like I mentioned before, it's about an instigator, like a pro-pipeline company trying to force a pipeline on a community, and also only looking at self-narrated expressions. If you look at how people are thinking, other people are feeling those emotions, I think you find a different message. Finally, why this kind of matters and where we're going. We are developing this as a module. So if you want to analyze emotional expressions in the ACF, this is one way you can do it. And it perhaps will lead to better understanding of conflicts, a more balanced portrayal of human nature in this framework, and more. If you want more out of this and more to engage us more, first off, this is kind of self-advertisement, Conference on Policy Process Research. We're holding in Denver. And I know Denver's a long ways away for many of you. We're doing our best to create a very strong online component to this. And so please consider applying. We can put the website in the chat, or if you just Google it, you should be able to find it, or just email me. And if you want to engage us even more, there is an ACF seminar that runs in the fall and the spring. It's monthly. We have presentations, we have discussants. It's a wonderful event. Please show up, because I think if you want to learn more about the ACF, it's a great way to do that. Finally, thank you again for this opportunity. I want to acknowledge all the great people that are part of this. This was originally part of a Sloan Foundation grant with Jill Yordi and Jung Yu having a major part of that, along with Tony Hakula, Katie Park, and Sharon Smolinski. And more recently, especially work on emotions, again, I presented this, but man, I owe debt to people like Tanya Haikala, Anna Crawford, Allegra, who's here, Kayla Gabehart, Arung Nam, Jill Yordi, Anna Dernova, and more. Again, if you want more information, reach out to me by email. And of course, I throw a bunch of our Twitter handles up there. Please follow us if you want to see what our latest ideas are. And at that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Stop sharing.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting and for sure very original presentation. I haven't heard before about this kind of studies, and you did very well in framing your research in the context of what other researchers are doing in the field. First, just to sum up the presentation you've made, first you review the conceptual approaches to advocacy coalitions that are around, pointing out that, interestingly, or like kind of obviously, most of the theoretical developments come from the North. And the other important thing, of course, is that emotional expressions of advocacy coalition is not something that is quite static. Now, coming to your specific research, it is interesting to know that you proved that your hypothesis. I have my questions. I see that there are some questions from the public as well. My first question, I will if you don't mind, I will post the 3 questions, the one that I have and the other 2, and then you have time to answer, and I give the public more time to submit further questions. So my question is that, do you think, I don't know if you have studied this, maybe you haven't studied, but it is clear that anti-pipeline in this case, or like anti-feelings are stronger than pro-feelings. And I was wondering if this is something that is it's not only related to their core belief of the people, but something that is an evolutionary advantage, that we evolved to be afraid of threats, and that needs to be strong enough to make us take the measures that we need to take to avoid any risk. So that is my question. Then there is another question that says, if you think that the study of emotional expressions in public speeches through artificial intelligence in social networks, active listening, for example, could be a good tool to guide public policies. And another question is, where do you think emotions start and belief systems end, or if they are at an extent overlap?
That's great. Thank you so much, Lana. And I do appreciate the comments and the questions, and they're all really good. And so let me start here. First of all, let me start with the this kind of the question. It was also in the chat I see from Alejandro about where does emotion start and belief systems ends? And are there, I don't know if I would say that do they start or end? I think they're just like this. They're together. And I think when we look at like when the ACF first emerged, for example, and they developed, let's say, the model of the assumptions of the person, and like they described the belief system, the ACF. At the time, I think a lot of the research kind of showed that kind of like the emotional part of our brain and let's say the thinking part of our brain were kind of separate, and we can kind of distinguish those. We can act rationally or with reason, maybe kind of isolate those emotions and separate them, like, you know, like the fictional character Spock on Star Trek, if you're into that sort of thing. And I think a lot of our citations, a lot of our research, not our research, but other people's research shows that that's just not the case, that our how we think and how we feel are just woven together. And so part of our goal here, especially in, you know, we're not looking at what goes on in our head, we're looking at how we're expressing our words. And so part of our goal here is to kind of just kind of weave together and marry the idea of like not just how we think, but also how we feel in our analysis of that text. What's interesting about this is that we've always done this to some extent, but we just didn't recognize it. So for example, in the ACF scholarship, I kind of mentioned this, but you might have someone, we may have coded, I'm angry about this pipeline. We would have just coded that as anti-pipeline. We may have coded, I'm happy about the pipeline as pro. But nowadays, we're actually, if we take the pro and con, we're just busting out the pro or con categories into these emotional expressions. So we might actually say, I love the pipeline, and actually code the word love as an emotional expression more than we did before. And so I think what we're doing here is actually pulling out more the flavor, more the, I would say even the more humanity of how we engage politically than we have before, not overlooking what we have overlooked before. And so where it begins or ends, I think they're all kind of, it's all woven together. So that's one question. The second question relates to, actually, Ivana, this is really cool. I might not say it exactly like you said it, but basically something about our evolutionary nature. This is the first question about how, you know, perhaps fear as like an emotional reaction, and especially perhaps fear of the unknown or something new. And does that kind of give extra force to the anti something advocacy coalition? Great question. And it's another way of saying this is like, you know, how much do these results actually generalize across different cases? And, you know, do the antis always have more like emotional expressions than the pros? And I think, you know, we're actually studying emotional expressions in a lot of different cases right now. And, you know, Kayla Gapehart is actually in the charge, along with Allegra here, on legislation. And there we find actually, like in testimonies at their state capitol in Colorado here, that actually, you know, people who are pro for a certain policy may actually have more kind of emotional expressions, at least in what we're looking at in the antis, signaling against the policy. But I think they're trying to, but I think it really depends on the case and also what the object's about. So this is about a pipeline. Perhaps on a policy topic, it could be about abortion restriction or voting rights or who knows what. I think it's really context specific. But your question is awesome in that it is probably linked to both how we kind of evolved as people, but also the context within which we're, those emotions are playing out. And so this is where it would be, I think as we go forward, one of the exciting things that I see is just trying to figure out how these emotions generalize across different settings, across pros and cons. I think across countries. I think one of the things we're missing in the ACF literature is that, we'll find coalitions everywhere. If you look for them in Argentina, in some settings, you'll find them. And yeah, okay, there's a pro, there's a con, maybe, but I think sometimes what we're different here is I do think that emotions are also tied to our culture, what we can express and so forth. And so I think if we start looking at these emotional expressions, I think we can start pulling out cultural patterns that we're not seeing before. And your final question, I believe, and I might have taken my notes wrong, and I just have a terrible memory now. I think related to kind of like why this matters, kind of how do these kind of link to kind of some sort of policy change? If I got that wrong, please let me know. And that's an interesting question. So this is like, so what? Why are we even doing this, right? And I think first off, it is like, okay, so our goal here is to understand politics and conflicts and coalitions, and I think we are kind of shining a light on some aspects of humanity and coalitions and politics we haven't done before. And we're not the first ones to do this. I think Anna Drenova kind of dropped off. She might have been here for a while, but people have been analyzing emotions in public policy for a long time. But the question is, how does it matter? And that's something where, like, if the level of conflict matters, and if these emotions can somehow shine a light on this conflict, we should be able to better understand the friction in our systems, the intransit hyper politicalization, and perhaps how people kind of can coalesce and not around common goals, or why they stay apart and so forth. It is interesting that some coalitions are geared around fear and some around, let's say, approval, right? And so perhaps if we start understanding these emotions, we might understand, like, how can we navigate these kind of conflicts we're seeing today, which are kind of scary in a lot of parts of the world, and especially the United States right now. We have a lot of conflict, and I think there is different emotions tied to them. And that doesn't even bring into the issues related to mobilization, and how we coalesce and how we kind of bring people together, because we also know that fear and anger can be very powerful emotions in that regard. And so there's maybe perhaps even like lessons in terms of how we kind of think about emotions as both political strategists and as researchers. Anyway, Yvonne, I hope I answered your questions. Of course, I can keep talking the entire 15 minutes left, so I'm going to stop.
Yes. No, you have answered the questions, definitely. I am finding one more question. We have some time yet. So if you don't mind, I will do it. That it says that are the emotions in conflict with the technical information that the ACF broker needs to work?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question too. So okay, so backing up. So a broker, so the ACF is all about, coalitions kind of fighting over long periods of time over a policy issue. And the broker concept came into play as this idea that, sometimes there's these people who their main concern is actually perhaps maintenance of a subsystem or an area, perhaps finding common ground, perhaps somehow ensuring the coalitions just don't fight forever. And so they kind of help kind of go back and forth like a mediator. And not all subsystems have brokers, although even the meaning of the broker is a complicated thing, but that's another story. Now, what's interesting here is like, okay, so what can a broker do with this? And how does this kind of also relate to, like, I think Alejandro's question is related to the technical information. A couple of things here. One is what I think Alejandro is getting at is brokers are often geared towards learning between coalitions. So it helps kind of coalitions kind of learn among each other. That's a great question. This is awesome. What's interesting about this is that you think a good broker would be attuned to the different emotional needs of the two coalitions that, let's say, this person's trying to like navigate in between. So I would think that this is like, good emotional intelligence would be a natural part of what a broker does well. But that said, it's also, I think there's also something about, as we think about like how we get our, first of all, I don't think, conflict has a place, policy conflict, political conflict. It's good in some situations and it can be bad in others. So I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, conflict's always a bad thing or a good thing. But sometimes if the goal is to somehow, let's say, ensure somehow coalitions can cooperate or collaborate, having some sort of emotional understanding of what the other coalition is experiencing, I think would go a long way, and not just for the brokers, but for either coalition. And so that's something that I think, as we go through this, I do work with a lot of communities, like, not for a couple of years now, but I'll go through and I'll map the conflict. Like, here's the different coalitions, I'll map out their beliefs, and I showed it to the two coalitions, and, and they've kind of, got a better understanding from like high 10,000 feet high view of what their conflict looks like and where the disagreements are. I can imagine doing that now, like maybe Allegra and I could do this and work with the Colorado community and try to figure out, hey, not just where you disagree in your beliefs, but also these are your different emotions that you're experiencing in this. And I can't imagine that not helping the community better understand each other. And along with learning and so forth.
Thank you, Chris. We have time for a final question. I will pass the word to Mariana, who asked me to directly speak to you because the question seems to be a little bit long.
Yes, sorry. The typing in English is sometimes challenging if you're also like with a time frame. Okay, so thank you for your talk, of course. And I was wondering, since you say that you go for the emotional expression as a passage to the belief that lies behind, I was wondering, what do we do? Like everyone that wants to basically have policies on emotions, what do we do? How do we deal with the fact that there's growing evidence on the effect that emotions have in our beliefs beforehand? So for example, affective realism, whenever we are in an emotional state that is important, we tend to perceive things differently according to our basic state, emotional state. So for example, if I'm afraid, I will see other people as a threat. So already, how do we deal with the fact that emotions are already behind, let's say, before our belief forming stage? Or I don't know, other examples are, I have written down, evenly affective realism, emotional attribution, the same. If I'm in a state of anger, I tend to see others as angry too. So it's easier for me to misread others. So if we are using expressions of emotions as if beliefs were clean behind it, and if we had an access, how do we deal with the fact that there's all these like new research on the contamination of our beliefs? How do we deal with that as like policymakers?
Well, as policymakers, first of all, let me just back up a little bit. Mariana, awesome questions. Love them. Okay, first off, you're talking almost like, I don't know if the right expression, almost like a causal model, right? Is emotions come before beliefs, beliefs come emotions, and how do we untangle that? I think I got three different things from what you said. That's part of it, and that's actually an awesome point. And right now we just don't know, right? Because what we're looking at is emotional expressions, what comes out. We don't know what goes on in our heads, and and that's something that I think. Maybe we'll get at with our Denver team, but it's a different type of question. And I can also imagine like doing experiments. I can imagine different types of research studies that can kind of untangle perhaps, what comes first, our beliefs about something or emotions about something. And I think part of it, what you're saying is how beliefs influence our preconceived notions or presuppositions about something. And I think that's spot on. And that's something that'd be fun to untangle in our work. But also what's challenging with what you said too, is this idea that I think also, and we show this too, with, we'll have in the newspapers, maybe one actor and maybe 30 statements and maybe 12 different emotional expressions. And so they could be angry about this, happy about that. And so, I always say kind of like this coalition shows a lot of fear. But man, if you just unpack that a little bit, you see there's what I like about our data. It's messy in the inside. It's not just fear. There's also, maybe dissatisfaction. maybe even some approval in there somehow. And so it's not just a clear cut, this is how someone's feeling. And if they are feeling that way, it's always about something, and it's probably always about a situation. And so it gets into like, oh, okay, how are we going? So if we really want to get into like how emotions are kind of affect various aspects of what we're seeing, we really need to like be careful not to overgeneralize how these emotions kind of play out in a setting, which also gets back to a different point, because the ACF talks about, these belief systems. Loads of evidence show that basically, and this is about any of us, take your favorite policy topic and ask yourself, how often do you change your beliefs about it? Not very much. You're probably the same beliefs about something 10 years ago as it is today. And our data show this basically, right? But also in one of our hypotheses, not shown today, but I think we'll play it out later, is that where policy core beliefs are very, very stable, emotions are less so. And so even though you might be angry about this policy today, maybe you'll have fear tomorrow, or maybe you'll have a different emotional expression. It's still, you still could be pro or con, but there might be different ways that emotions play in with those policy core beliefs. And maybe you're still against the policy, but maybe you're just, a little more content about it, for example, not so emotionally charged. And so I think as policymakers, one thing, backing up a little bit, first off, as an academic, first thing I like to do is spend time understanding, the phenomenon we're looking at. I like working with decision makers also, but I think we have a lot to learn about how stable these emotional expressions are in relation to beliefs and how they interrelate, because I think you will see differences in the rate of change and stability, and also very contextually centered. Mariana, did I just, my handwriting, by the way, is terrible, but I think I got, did I get your questions? Yeah, okay. And I know there's a lot of people. Oh, go ahead, Ivana.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariana, for your question and insights. Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. I don't know if someone from your team, Allegra, wants to say something. If not, I will pass the word to Alejandro to give the final words.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and your attention today. And just mirroring a little bit, like just a few other kind of comments that I pulled out from some of the questions. I heard some really good questions about the ideas of emotional intensity and in terms of like pro and anti, and that's definitely something that we've started to think about more and we'll continue to research and welcome others' ideas about. And the other piece that, I really was thinking about your question, Mariana, was like emotions and the role of almost what we call like misinformation or disinformation, and kind of how all of those pieces interplay. And I think that those are all really exciting questions. And I just really enjoyed the discussion and the presentation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Allegra. Thank you. Please, it's a pleasure to have you here in our webinar. And please, can you send us your PowerPoint, the translation to Spanish after the webinar?
Absolutely.
So thanks a lot. It's a pleasure for us. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, pleasure too. And thank you for the questions and the engagement and just the opportunity. It really has been fun. So yeah, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.